Good morning, everybody. I am Cassidy McAllister, and this is the session that is for PBLs and CTE, no problem. So what we're going to be doing this morning is I have a pre-recorded session that has some slides and some information on there for you guys, and it'll play as a video, and then I will walk through the takeaways that I have provided for you, and then we are going to go through any questions that you might have, so feel free to drop those in the chat, and I can go over those questions with you. But at this time, we're going to go ahead and go over to that pre-recorded video that has all of the information that you're looking for. PBLs and CTE, no problem. A guide to implementing PBLs in CTE classes. Hi, I am Cassidy McAllister. I am the Gladeville Middle School Agri-Science teacher. This is my second year teaching at the school, and I am originally from Western Kentucky. I moved to Middle Tennessee, where I currently live with my husband and my dog. I graduated from Murray State University with a degree in agriculture education and a chemistry certification. Now, a little bit about my school. Gladeville Middle School opened in July of 2019, so we're relatively new. We have around 800 students in grades 6 through 8. We're a middle-class suburban and rural area of the county, in the county just west of Nashville, Tennessee, so Wilson County. And in our school, we have a variety of STEM-based learning environments. We have our agriculture classroom, various science labs, an outdoor classroom, a STEM lab, and a Z-Space lab as well. For the CTE side of things, for agriculture specifically, we do have a small garden and a chicken coop that was added in fall of 2020. And then we did have a mini greenhouse that was added in spring of 2021, as well as a garden. So overall, a basic overview of what's going to happen in this session is that we're talking about implementing PBL into the classroom, into a CTE classroom in as smooth of a way as possible. So I've got 4 basic things that we are going to talk about today. Number 1, planning. What do I need in order to plan a successful unit? Number 2, engaging. What steps do I need in order to engage all students? Number 3, assess. How do I assess this unit equitably and efficiently? And then number 4, reflect. What went well in this unit and what could be changed? One thing that I do want to take a moment to discuss is what is the difference between a project and problem-based learning or project-based learning. So you'll hear all kinds of different things that people will say. You'll see it in all kinds of different websites. But basically the gist is that projects are done. They can be done alone. They can be done with groups. They are basically teacher directed. They're not necessarily related to the real world. And all projects really have the same goal, which is that assessment piece. Whereas project-based learning is requiring teacher guidance, but not direction. It's all about that process. It's very student directed. And a lot of times the key aspect is that it is real world experiences, real world problems that it's based on. So all of that learning is occurring throughout the entire project and that entire process. And the students are the ones that determine that outcome. So the way that I really like to look at it is that instead of teachers, taking hold of that questioning, planning, researching, creating, improving, and presenting portion, teachers are overlooking that in a problem-based learning environment rather than just a project. And the students, instead of just being involved in that creating, improving, and presenting portion of the project, they are involved in the entire process. They start with the questions. They help with the planning, the researching, and then creating that product, that project. So they've got a hand in everything for the entire process. And the way that I like to think of it is that the project is just that dessert. It's that finish to the main to the entire meal. It looks pretty. It's really easy. It's simple. It is just that dessert. Whereas the problem-based learning is that main course. It's the big deal. It's the whole thing. It's what you're looking forward to. And then it includes that dessert at the end. So it's the entire meal rather than just that dessert. one of the things that I really want to talk about, it's the first step. It's probably the most important step. If you want to set yourself up for a smooth implementation of a PBL into a CTE classroom, the very most important part is going to be the plan, that beginning piece of setting everything up for success. There are 4 key components when setting yourself up to plan a PBL. So in order to plan a project-based learning unit, the number one thing that you should focus on and the very first thing that you should start with are the standards and objectives. What are those standards that I need to teach? The next thing that you should look at is implementation from the real world. What does this look like in the real world? The third thing are your project ideas. So coming up with those project ideas. What kinds of projects could we do? And then fourth and finally, you have your resources. What resources and materials do I need in order to make this unit happen? So if you are able to follow along with these 4 things, then we'll go into those a little bit deeper and understand why those are so important in helping you plan a successful PBL unit. First, your standards and objectives. These are going to be the most important parts. Your question that you should be answering is, which standards do I want to teach? Now, of course, in all kinds of different CTE classes, there's lots of different various sets of standards that you might be using. For example, the standards for an ag class in a middle school setting are very different from the STEM ones, which are different from the high school standards that are offered or that are available. So the thing that you need to make sure that you're doing is know your standards and make sure you're picking those first. So what you need to do is, number 1, make the project fit the standards. You don't want the standards to fit the project. So for example, if you know that you want to have a unit about something physiology and anatomy related, make sure that that's a standard that you would be teaching. You don't want to come up with an anatomy project and then go back and find an anatomy standard. Instead, if you are focusing on aerodynamics as a standard, then from there in a STEM class, you can work to make a project for an aerodynamics standards. My biggest suggestion is to start with the big rocks. Now, when I'm talking about big rocks for a standard, I'm referring to those ones that aren't necessarily super tiny specific standards. So for example, in agriculture, you might have one where students pass a safety test regarding ag mechanic tools. That one might be a little too specific and a little too task-oriented for a PBL unit to be successful. So what I would want to choose instead is something with a main idea. So I'm wanting to look for those clusters of standards. So if I have, I know in ag science that they have sections of standards that are for horticulture, plant science. Looking and grouping those together would be a great start for what standards you need to cover and what standards would lend itself well to a PBL project, because you can cover multiple in a PBL project. Another example might be with business standards if you're focusing on communication, and that's one set of standards that you're looking at. Focus on those and a project or a problem that would be occurring in the real world. Next, you want to connect those standards and choose standards that are connecting to other content areas. Now, being an exploratory or being an elective or those kinds of things, this is where that really comes into play. As a CTE class, I know that what I teach students is, number 1, important, and number 2, helpful to those core classes that my students are taking. I know that in my class that they're learning communication skills, they're learning how to write, they're learning some history, they're learning science standards, they're learning how to incorporate math. All of those things are going to be really easy to connect into my PBL unit. But one thing I do need to make sure that I do is that I'm specifically choosing standards that do that. Now, finally, the big question that I ask myself is, are these standards worth my time? If this standard that I've chosen is too specific, is that just going to waste the time doing an entire project a week of my time when I could just cover this standard in one day? Or is this project, this group of standards that I've chosen, is this going to take this approximately the same amount of time and provide the same amount of value as if I were just teaching them straight to the students? Next, when planning a PBL unit, you really want to focus, what does this look like in the real world? If you're wanting the students to take action in their learning, using this content has to be applicable to their lives, to their future lives or their possible future lives. So ask yourself, who uses these standards in everyday life? If you don't know, it's your task to reach out to others in that field. Maybe I don't 100% know exactly what it takes in order to run a Christmas tree farm and all of that that it entails, but I can run right down the road to the local Christmas tree farm and reach out to them and say, hey, I really need your advice. I need some help. Can you help me with planning this? Or can you answer a few of my questions? One thing that you can do is you can look around your school. Maybe you don't have the math brains in order to help you with this unit in STEM, but you know that there are plenty of successful math teachers in your school. Whereas you can also look into your community. So if you're not exactly sure what community service activities look like, or what the help in your community, what is needed in your community, reach out to your community members, or even reach out across the nation. We are such a virtual world right now that you can reach out through email, through Zoom, through text, any of those social media, any of those ways to reach out and communicate and collaborate with people who are actually in that industry, doing and working on these standards in their real life every single day. Finally, one thing that you can think about is what needs to be changed in your school, community, and nation. The people that are living that situation day in and day out are going to be the experts. You may not know everything, but I guarantee you know someone who knows more. So when thinking about what does this look like in the real world, you're wanting to figure out what is the most authentic way for students to show their learning. And this is regarding the real world. How can they get out there? How can they show their true learning and learn about things that matter? This PBL unit that I've started to develop work with the virtual world right now that you can reach out through email, through Zoom, through text, any of those social media, any of those ways to reach out. And first question that you're asking students and having them engage with. So that terminology knowledge may not be there yet. Next. Virtual world right now that you can reach out through email, through Zoom, through text, any of those social media, any of those ways to reach out and communicate and collaborate with people who are actually in that industry, doing and working on these standards in their real life every single day. Finally, one thing that you can think about is what needs to be changed in your school, community, and nation. The people that are living that situation day in and day out are going to be the experts. You may not know everything, but I guarantee you know someone who knows more. So when thinking about what is this, PBLs and CTE, no problem. A guide to implementing PBLs in CTE classes. Hi, I am Cassidy McAllister. I am the you need to focus on that launch. Number 2, making the research process fun and easy helps engage your students. And number 3, keeping your students accountable and on task by working through conferences will help keep your students engaged. With the launch, this is one of the most exciting times for your students, besides that final presentation. You want to get your students excited from the very get-go. What will pique the interest of your students and what will get them asking questions? Those are the two main goals that you have when you're starting a launch. There are tons of ideas out there for having a launch to a PBL unit, but some of the most common ones that you'll see are field trips, guest speakers, product testing, and things of that nature. Now, here's the deal. This is when your creativity should shine. So if you have this big, brilliant, blowout idea, this is when to implement it. You want to get students engaged at the very beginning and so that enthusiasm carries them through the project. They want to learn more. That is the number one goal of the launch. For example, if you have students that are focusing on communication skills and marketing skills in a business class, and you're doing a restaurant launch for students, you may focus on taking them to a newly opened business with marketing and advertisements that are just starting up, or you could even try having them have a guest speaker of a new business owner come in. But you can also try things such as product testing, where they actually get to test the product to see what the hype is all about. All of those ideas are ways to get your students curious and to get them thinking. Next, making that research process easy and fun. In order to have your students carry that enthusiasm throughout the rest of the project, you need to make sure that when they're researching, when they're looking for the answers to their questions, they, number one, know how, and number two, stay engaged. Research is more than just students using Google. Now, when you tell your students that they're going to research, that's probably the first thing that pops into their head. But there's more ways for you to help them research various things for them to learn. They could be interviewing a professional from that industry. They could be going and reading a book. They could be searching Google. They could be looking through different materials that you've provided. If you give your students 2 days to research and you haven't curated that content to allow them to find things to pick from, then they may be overwhelmed with all of the different options. Your number one resource in this situation is your librarian. They know what that research process should look like. So I highly encourage you to bring in your librarian to help you curate that content, curate those resources, and teach the students how to do their research. Your librarian will answer any questions you might have for this process. They are also going to help your students by modeling those steps of the research process. So even if you don't bring in your librarian, you still need to model the steps of the research process. So asking questions, what are the key terms I'm looking for? How do I look for a reliable source and things like that in order to model that process for your students? That makes it much easier for them to follow along. Also, provide ways for them to organize the information that they're collecting. If you just say research and you say nothing more or show them nothing more, then they're just going to start copying and pasting links to a web page, or links from a web page to a document, or copying and pasting information to a document. They're not going to know how to organize their thoughts. So what you can do is you can provide all kinds of different graphic organizers, sketch notes, different activities for them to do in order to organize those thoughts, or have them work together in a group in order to communicate those thoughts those things that they've learned. Last but not least, in order for students to stay engaged and to actually learn through the research process, you need to make sure that you're incorporating discussion or application into that research section of your PBL unit. So if you have students communicate with each other, and specifically this is talking about having students say, here's what I've learned, and sharing it with other people, or applying that knowledge by taking what they've learned about a topic and actually having that be applied. For example, if I have students that have learned about the For example, if I have students that have learned about the elements of art and the principles of design when regarding landscapes, having them actually apply that by incorporating a writing or discussing with each other how they know that X, Y, and Z landscapes are either good or bad will help them internalize that information and make sure that it is concrete in their brains. Being intentional with the way that you start the research process, complete the research process, and share that information is going to make it so much easier and more engaging for your students. Now, once your students have started that process, a lot of them are going to break off into different areas. So you may have some students that are still finishing up their research. You may have some that are already moved on and starting their brainstorming process. So what you need to do to keep your students accountable and on task are conferences. This is the number one way to help make sure that you stay engaged in their learning process without directing what they're learning and how they're doing that. Now, there's 3 basic types of conferences. Number 1 are those informal conferences. These are things like flybys, where you just pop around the room and check on all of your different groups or check on each of your students. You may have a little notebook where you're writing down that Sally did this and Johnny's on this part, or this Susie's on this step, or maybe you just keep notes in general, or maybe you're just checking to make sure that students are on task. Next, you have formal conferences. These are conferences where you may have group on teacher versus group conferences where you're discussing with the group where they're at, or you may even have one-on-ones with each individual student. What are you doing to help your partners? What are you doing to stay on task? What's your next step? Where are you going from here? And then, of course, there are the student help conferences. These are conferences that are initiated by students when they're stuck and can't go any further in their process. Conferences are a way to keep students accountable and provide that feedback in order to move them forward through that learning process. In order to keep your students engaged throughout this entire process, you need to start by making sure that that launch is engaging and interesting, piquing their curiosity and getting them to ask questions. Moving forward to the research process, you need to make sure that you're guiding them and helping them through that process, learning what they can, still staying engaged, and last but not least, conferences are your friend. They help keep your students accountable and on task. The next step is to look at assessments. Now, these might be one of the more important roles as a teacher for this process, or it might be what you think of as super important for this process. So the 3 main things for you to think about are, number 1, your assessment timeline, building in assessments throughout the entire unit. Number 2, your assessment options. What kinds of assessments do you even have available for you and your students? And then 3rd, feedback and practice. These are 2 very important aspects for the assessment aspect in a PBL unit. How can you help your students improve their performance? If they're not learning, it's not a successful or smooth PBL unit. Now, when looking at an assessment timeline, this is something that you can actually incorporate into your planning process at the beginning. Looking at a calendar and saying that I want my PBL unit to last for 3 weeks, and here's what we're going to learn the first week, here's what I want my students to learn the second week, here's what I want the students to learn the third week, or here's the assessment 1, assessment 2, assessment 3, and building that in throughout your unit. Sit down and schedule out those deadlines. You may do this in unit chunks by lesson. Maybe you're going to do a mini lesson about plant anatomy, and then you're going to do a mini lesson about soil, and then you're going to do a mini lesson about hydroponics. Or maybe you look at it week 1, week 2, week 3. Break your unit into manageable chunks. Now, this could be daily chunks or it could be small sections. So you say, here's the first section where students are learning about aerodynamics on airplanes. Here's the second section where they're learning about helicopters and so forth. Then you need to consider how you need to scaffold and differentiate for your students. You're going to have students who are going to wind up in different places because of where their learning takes place and how long it takes for them to make those connections. Now, for some of your students, this scaffolding process may look like X amount of research is needed compared to others, or X number of resources are needed in the research process. Maybe you have a rubric that is based on accuracy of information gathered rather than 10 facts that are needed, and differentiating for each of your students. Next, I really suggest adding in mini lessons into your timeline. Rather than just a culminating project at the very end where you hope that they've learned what they need to learn, you take the initiative to add in a mini lesson that will help guide them for learning about the particles of soil. And then you move forward to how does pollution affect soil, and doing mini lessons that the students can manage and learn as they go and incorporate those little chunks. It's going to be much easier for you in assessment-wise, and it's going to be much easier for your students. Breaking your unit into chunks is more manageable for you and your students. Now, once you've got an idea of like what those little chunks look like for your unit, you can start breaking out and looking at what kinds of assessments that you even have available, or what assessments you could do for each of those units. Now, we talked earlier about having those teacher observation notes during conferences. Those are great times to have observation notes and looking at what does this student learn, what kinds of questions have they asked, where are they in this process. You can also have students keep up with that by having student journals. They can have a daily writing where they write about what they've learned or where they are in their process and grading themselves. You can have exit slips and bell ringers and many formative assessments where you just check, did my students know the parts of a plant? Check. Moving forward. You can have checklists. Do your students know X, Y, and Z? Do they have these things in their project or in their product? Rubrics. I am a huge fan of using rubrics in CTE classes because so many of our standards are rubric based. They are based on does your student know this, this, and this, and how well do they know that? Or have they, especially those performance-based activities. So my student is able to pull a soil sample. You put a rubric together for that, and it shows the steps of what they should do. Were they able to do step 1, step 2, step 3? Yes, move forward. There are all kinds of different rubrics that you can find already created for so many different lessons, and I highly suggest for you to check those out. Next, you can always incorporate quizzes and tests into your Pbl unit. This unit is not in addition to things that they should have already known or should already know. This is taking the place and teaching those standards. You still can use quizzes and tests because they are still able to use that knowledge, learn that knowledge, and apply it in those situations. Written reflections. Now, these are going to be things that are typically done at the end of the unit, but it allows you to see what did the students learn, how engaged were they. And then finally, student plans. The students set up, here's the goals that I have for my unit, here's the goals that I have for my group. Did they accomplish those? And that takes it into the student's own hands to, number one, set those goals and strive for them, but also number two, it takes that grading aspect into their own hands as well. Assessment helps provide student accountability and guides their progress. If they have something that they're working for, they have something they're working towards, they're going to continue through that process. Now, last but not least, absolutely not least, is the most important aspect of all assessment pieces during this unit, and that is feedback and practice. You want to ensure that your students are improving their performance. If they're starting at a lower spot, you want them to be at a higher spot of knowledge by the time they finish the unit. You want to strive to provide students encouragement and feedback in order to guide the students to where they need to be. Now, if the students are taking the learning into their own hands, because that's the way that Pbl units are set up, then you want the students to also play an important role in looking at where am I now, where do I need to be next. So if you're able to guide the students along the unit, then you're able to help them figure out where they need to go and take ownership in their own learning. One of my favorite ways to provide feedback is a start, stop, continue. Now, these are really easy to implement because you can talk with your students when they're conferencing. Here's one thing you need to stop doing. You need to stop talking to other groups about non-related subjects. Start. You need to start focusing on what comes next, or you need to start working on your project as soon as you come into my classroom, and then continue. I want you to continue communicating with your group effectively and figuring out where you guys need to go next. These are really actionable pieces of feedback for your students to know what they need to stop doing, start doing, and continue doing. Next, allow your students the opportunity to prep and rehearse their presentations. Now, if you're incorporating that real-world aspect and you're bringing in judges or you're bringing in an audience for them, these students may have never had that opportunity before, or they have limited interaction with these people. So it's important for you to allow them the opportunity to practice and get all of those funky little kinks out, make adjustments, and then present their final presentations. In the end, your feedback should be actionable for students. They should be able to move forward and be guided through that process based on your feedback and their practice that they've been doing in this unit. Now, when you're looking at the assessment piece, you need to figure out, number one, when are your assessments going to be? What are those assessments going to be? And how can you provide feedback for your students to help them move forward? The last component of a PBL unit is the reflection aspect. There are 4 key components of the reflection aspect. Number one, a public audience. Who can help provide authentic reflection and feedback for this project? Number 2, self-reflection. How can students reflect on their own learning during this project? Number 3, unit reflection. How can you, as the teacher or the instructor, improve this unit? And number 4, teacher reflection in general. How can I improve the PBL experience for my students? Now, that first aspect, the public audience. Who can help provide authentic reflection and feedback for this project? Your key term here is authentic. An authentic audience is key in a PBL project. It takes it from being just another project that students work on to being something that they're striving for, a goal that they're setting, and adding that real world aspect. So if you as a STEM teacher are looking at pollution, and those are the standards that you're focusing on, how can you bring in a real life environmental engineer to talk about and who knows about those pollution aspects? The audience should be able to discuss the work and provide feedback. So that's why it's super important that it's an authentic audience so they know what they're talking about when they ask those questions. Rather than just bringing in some extra teachers who are there in the school, who are on their planning and happen to volunteer, bring in someone who is knowledgeable about the subject and can ask the students questions that make them think, and it encourages the students to realize that this matters. As experts in your field, community leaders, professionals, these are all great examples of people that you can bring in as a public audience for your presentations and projects. And then also remember that technology can be a great way to share products and presentations with an engaged audience. You can Zoom with people. You can share those types of things, projects and products, pictures, videos to social media and encourage people to check those out. The technology that we have access to can help our students reach more people and a bigger audience than ever before. An authentic audience acts as a motivation for quality student work. Students become engaged because they realize that people are depending on this, that they're engaged in their work, and that they're ready to see a change or ready to see a solution to a problem. Self-reflection. Students reflecting on their own learning. So this aspect is for students to realize, here's where I started, here's where I ended, and looking at that process in between of how they got there. So they may have thoughts on their finished product, thoughts on their time management, thoughts on the actual learning process. They may have evaluations about group efforts and their group projects. They may have thoughts on how they like to learn. Maybe they really like this project, or maybe they're not too sure about the research aspect. Maybe they have ideas for future projects that they could work on, or future ideas that they would be really interested to learn. Allow students to grow from their own reflections. A unit reflection. Now, as a teacher or as an instructor, this is on you. What went well? What didn't go well? What can you looking at this unit, what can you change to make it better? So some key questions you might ask are, did my students learn effectively in this environment or this setting? Did this content lend itself well to the PBL style? If you feel like you're having to reteach over and over again and the students aren't understanding the standards for this unit, this would not be a unit that I would use in a PBL format moving forward. So for example, with me, if I have something that's super simple about the parts of a plant for my ag kiddos, I'm probably not going to pick a PBL unit based on parts of a plant because it would not lend itself well to a PBL, a project style unit. Again, looking at that reflection piece or that feedback piece of start, stop, continue, you can look at, here are things that I need to stop doing in my PBL unit or in this unit in general. Here are things I need to start doing in this unit and things that can continue because they're working. And then you can also look at what other mini lessons should you add to help students grow more or to learn more. What would you add to make this unit go a little more smoothly? So if that is more conferences or more direct instruction, looking at those aspects. And then finally, did the final project or presentation go well? Ultimately, you should be looking at what should be changed in this unit. Last but not least is the teacher reflection. How can I improve the PBL experience? A CTE class, your PBLs are already realistic and related to the real world for the most part. So what you need to focus on is how can you improve that experience that allows students to make those connections themselves. So did this Pbl incorporate an authentic audience? If you're not bringing in a real audience, I highly suggest you start that. Does this Pbl include a real world experience? Do you get to allow students to have that actual experience or to move forward with what the product they came up with? Did my students engage with each other and their community? Involving group work in CTE classes is a great way to learn and teach your students those communication skills and those teamwork skills that they need to know going forward. Did this approach allow students to demonstrate their learning in various ways? Now, personally, as a CTE ag teacher, I know that a lot of the students that really get into my classes may not do quite as well in a more structured classroom in their English class or in their math class, but they can get into the ag lab and they can put together a piece of equipment just like that because they're really good with their hands. So if you allow students to have various ways to show their learning, maybe they do a how-to video, or maybe they're doing a presentation where they're speaking, or maybe they're doing a video interview. Whatever that way that they can show that they've learned what they need to learn about this content, did you allow them to do that? And then, did this method promote a love of learning? You want your students to stay curious, to be curious, to want to learn more, to ask questions, to get answers, and to keep moving forward. Now, ultimately, the question you should be asking yourself is, would you utilize PBL as a method again in your classroom? PBL units can be a great tool for your students to use, but you have to make sure that they're being implemented smoothly. So what I've done is I've set up the process of how to implement a PBL in a CTE class, but I want you to focus on these 4 main things. The planning process, engaging your students, what assessments look like, and how the reflection and the unit wraps up. So these 4 steps can help you set yourself up for a smooth PBL implementation into a CTE class. Now, I did set up these 4 aspects of PBL planning and that unit planning process. But what I also wanted to do is provide some takeaways. So not only should you walk away with the idea of here's how I do a PBL unit plan, here are also 3 things that I'm going to include for you to take away with you after you finish this session. So I want to provide, number 1, some example ideas. I have some examples of middle school and high school CTE, PBL ideas. I want to provide you with some ag ones, some STEM ones, some business ones, any of those CTE classes that are involved here. I want to provide those example ideas of either ones that I've done or ones that I've seen that have worked really well for other teachers. Number 2, I want to provide some planning checklists. How can you set yourself up by planning a PBL and making sure that you have all the things that you need in order to plan and set yourself up for success? And then finally, I want to provide you with some assessment tools. So these may be things like rubrics that are very general and allow you to assess a couple different ideas or tasks for students. Conferencing sheets so that you can set yourself up to do some flybys or you do one-on-ones and gathering information. And then a couple other things that will help you with assessing your students. These are just a handful of helpful books and articles that I really use to help guide my research and my knowledge in this subject. If you have any questions after this session ends, feel free to reach out. I'm happy to brainstorm with you or work through some problems that you might be having with your students. Thank you for joining my session. Stick around to ask any questions you might have, and maybe we can come up with some brainstorming ideas for some people in our little session here. Have a great day. All right, so thank you so much for joining us on that session. I do know that we had a little bit of an issue with the video, but that this session has been recorded and it will be available around 60 minutes after this session ends. So feel free to go back. And then, of course, if you have any questions, you can pop them in the chat box that is over to the, I think, the left of my screen. I did have one question that came through. This question says, how many PBLs do you typically complete in a quarter? So the way that my class is set up in the middle school environment is that we have our students every other day for a semester. So in my class, that's typically about the length of a quarter since we are doing it every other day. So I'll go through 2 or 3 within that time frame. Of course, that's about 9 weeks worth of content. And what I like to do is base my units around a PBL. So I might have one about plant science and have a PBL with that. And then I might have one for animal science, and we might have one for environmental science. So it really depends, especially on the age. So with my 8th graders, they are able to get through 3 PBLs because they're very used to the structure of my class at that point. My 6th graders will probably get through about 2. And then the average length of my computer, not my computer, the average length of my PBLs are usually about 2 weeks worth of actual content. Potentially 3, but with that being an every other day type thing for my class, then that usually extends it to be about 6 weeks for my classes if they have the time to work on that in the class and they're not doing anything at home. Then that is usually around 5 or 6 weeks for each content or PBL project. If there's anybody else that has questions. All right. If you have any other questions, feel free to drop them on that chat and I will be there to answer those questions for you. But I think other than that, we are fixing to wrap up the session. I am happy to answer any other questions you might have, though. All right. Well, again, I do want to share that the takeaways you can download down below this session. I have things from checklists that help you get through the PBL planning process. and more.